In the summer of 1590, Governor John White returned to Roanoke Island, only to be met with a scene that would haunt history forever. What once had been a lively settlement of 115 men, women, and children, including Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, was now utterly silent, devoid of a single soul. The homes stood fully built, yet eerily abandoned, their interiors empty, the signs of life gone cold and still. There were no footprints in the dirt, no broken doors or barricades, no telltale markers of violent struggle or hurried flight. Instead, the colony presented something far more unsettling, a chilling void, as if its inhabitants had simply vanished into thin air. The only clues left behind were two cryptic carvings, the word croatoan etched deeply into a gatepost and the letters KRO carved faintly on a nearby tree. These enigmatic words, the colonists' sole message, hung like a cryptic cipher in the quiet air. Governor White had previously arranged a code with the settlers. If they were forced to leave under duress, a Maltese cross would be carved above their destination. But here no such cross was found. Was this a sign that the departure was intentional, a planned journey to Croatoan Island, rather than a hurried escape or a violent demise? This haunting tableau, the dismantled homes, the eerie silence, the single carved word, transformed the Roanoke Colony's fate into a perplexing, unsolved mystery that has baffled historians and captivated imaginations for centuries. It is a true crime of history in which the victims left behind almost no trace, no bodies, no bloodshed, just an ominous whisper carved into wood that pointed to a possible new home that was never reached or never confirmed. The stakes of this disappearance could not be higher. The lost colony was England's bold attempt to stake a permanent claim in the New World, a gamble made under the watchful eye of Queen Elizabeth I and orchestrated by Sir Walter Raleigh. This was more than just a settlement. It was a strategic foothold, designed to challenge Spanish dominance, a beacon of English hope in an unknown and untamed land. Within this vulnerable community lived families, children, and pioneers fueled by faith, ambition, and the dream of building a new life. Yet, as White stood amid the hollow structures, he faced questions with no answers. What had happened to those 115 souls? Had they moved, as the carving suggested? Had they found refuge with neighboring indigenous tribes? Or were they victims of an unseen catastrophe? Why leave behind a message but disappear completely? The silence only deepened the mystery. As we begin the investigation into the lost colony, imagine the weight of that quiet disarray, the empty hearths, the abandoned tools, the flickers of a life suddenly and inexplicably interrupted. Listen closely because that silence is loud, bearing the echoes of survival, desperation, hope, and ultimately disappearance. This is a story that demands rigorous inquiry, a puzzle that challenges us to peer into the shadows of early American history and uncover the truth behind Roanoke's silent message. What happened when the lights went out on this fledgling English settlement? That is the enigma that unfolds here, the vanishing act that remains one of history's most baffling and haunting questions. Life on Roanoke Island was far from the hopeful vision painted by England's imperial ambitions. Under the auspices of Sir Walter Raleigh and Queen Elizabeth I, the island was to be the English foothold in a fiercely contested New World, a strategic challenge to Spain's dominance in the Americas, and a launching point for expanding English influence. Raleigh envisioned Roanoke as a military and economic base, one from which English privateers could disrupt Spanish treasure fleets and from which Protestant Christianity might spread. But the reality that greeted the colonists was a stark collision between this imperial hubris and unforgiving circumstance. The colony's first years were a litany of hardship and unrelenting struggle. The flagship Tiger, carrying much of the settlers' provisions, ran aground on arrival, destroying the bulk of their supplies and leaving barely a month's worth of food for the hundreds who disembarked. This crippling loss, compounded by delays and diversions in resupply missions due to European conflicts, such as the Anglo-Spanish War and tensions in the Netherlands, thrust the colonists into a desperate survival struggle from the outset. Their isolation was deepened by treacherous navigation around the Outer Banks, with shifting shoals and storms that made returning ships unreliable or impossible. It was a remote outpost planted on a fragile edge of empire, heavily dependent on the surrounding indigenous communities for sustenance and survival. Yet, the initial cautious optimism about relations with the native peoples quickly gave way to tension and outright hostility. Central to this fraught dynamic were key indigenous figures like Manteo and Wanchese, whose interactions with the English reveal the complexity beneath surface impressions of friend and foe. Manteo of the Croatoan tribe, for instance, became a vital intermediary, baptized and given the title Lord of Roanoke. His alliance symbolized the tentative possibilities for cohabitation and cooperation. Meanwhile, Wanchese, from the Roanoke tribe, exhibited deep suspicion and grew increasingly estranged from the English presence. These two men personified the divergent indigenous responses to colonial incursions, open engagement and alliance on the one hand, wary resistance on the other. Another key figure was Pemisapan, the Weroans or chief of the Roanoke people, originally known as Wingina before changing his name. His actions reflected indigenous agency and strategy rather than passive victimhood. With rising hostilities, Pemisapan decisively cut off the colony's food supply, aiming to undermine the English foothold. In response, the colonists launched a preemptive strike that culminated in the beheading of Pemisapan, exacerbating tensions and violent cycles. This brutal act marked a catastrophic fracture in native colonial relations. Cultural misunderstandings theorize a significant role in escalating conflict. The English demand for submission and resources, coupled with insensitivity toward indigenous customs, clashed with the native people's sovereignty and survival strategies. The colonists' choice to burn the village of Aquascagok in retaliation for a missing silver cup exemplifies how quickly minor disputes spiraled into destructive violence, coupled with the spread of diseases to which the indigenous peoples had no immunity. These acts amplified distrust and accelerated hostilities. Food shortages, isolation, and hostile relations rendered the colony's existence tenuous at best. Initial assumptions of easy domination or partnership with native tribes gave way to a grim reality. The colonists, who had set out to tame and benefit from these new lands, instead found themselves entrapped in an unforgiving wilderness, relying on fragile truces that could shatter at any moment. Attempts to attack presumed enemies sometimes misfired, such as the accidental assault on friendly Croatoans, revealing the fog of fear and confusion that clouded survival. This relentless nightmare of scarcity and conflict humanizes the colonists not merely as lost adventurers or imperial pawns, but as desperate, vulnerable people caught in a wilderness of competing interests and unpredictable dangers. Their plight was not merely geopolitical, but deeply personal, marked by hunger, fear, and the shadow of violence on all sides. In this crucible of hardship, the colonists had to navigate a complex social landscape where alliances could be lifelines or death traps. Trust was scarce, suspicion was survival. The stories of Manteo, Wanchese, and Pemisapan illuminate these fractured human relationships, where strategies for survival intertwined with cultural identities and power struggles. The colonists' fate, whether integration, flight, or destruction, was inseparable from these fraught encounters. By understanding the colonists' struggle for survival amid food shortages, worsened by delayed supplies, strained and sometimes violent relations with indigenous peoples, and the unpredictable New World environment, we can see beyond the myth of the lost colony. We glimpse a human story of ambition meeting harsh reality, of fragile hopes battered by unforgiving challenges, and of individuals entwined in a larger, tragic collision of worlds. These struggles set the stage for the mysterious vanishing that would follow, a disappearance born not only of external forces, but of internal fracture and desperation. It was a human story etched in the hardship of survival, the limits of empire, and the tragic consequences when two vastly different societies collide without true understanding or mutual trust. As we move forward in this investigation, the raw reality of life on Roanoke Island provides essential context for the silence that descended, the empty homes, the cryptic carvings, and the haunting mystery that continues to echo through history. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke is a haunting mystery whispered through the centuries, punctuated by silence and a single cryptic word, croatoan. It is within this silence and carved enigma that we find the most compelling clues to the fate of the 115 men, women, and children who vanished from their settlement sometime before Governor John White's desperate return in 1590. Today, we delve deeply into those clues and the prevailing theories they have inspired, seeking to unravel the truth buried beneath layers of history, speculation, and archaeological discovery. Governor White's arrival at the abandoned colony was met with a scene that was striking not for violence or chaos, but for eerie quiet and absence. There were no signs of battle, no bloodshed, no mass graves laid bare, only dismantled homes and a perplexing message carved into wood. The word croatoan was etched into a gatepost, with the shorter zero carved into a nearby tree. These markings, far from being random graffiti, were understood by White to be a prearranged code set by the colonists themselves. Importantly, no Maltese cross was present alongside the carvings. This absence held vital significance. It indicated the message was not one of distress or forced evacuation. Instead, it suggested a purposeful, non-distress signal that the colonists had moved deliberately, pointing them toward Croatoan Island, the home of a friendly indigenous group known as the Croatoan tribe. The presence of this carved word sparked a prevailing theory that the colonists, confronted with dwindling resources, hostility, and the debilitating delay in resupply due to war in Europe, had chosen assimilation as their best chance for survival. Integration with the Croatoan tribe, in essence joining with a friendly indigenous community rather than perishing isolated, offers the most widely supported explanation for the colony's disappearance. This theory gains further weight through archaeological discoveries on what is now Hatteras Island, part of the Croatoan people's historic territory. Excavations have revealed tantalizing evidence of sustained English presence long after the colony's official vanishing. Among the finds are 16th century English iron flakes known as hammer scale, a residue from blacksmith activities, which indigenous groups at that time would not have had the technology to produce. Such iron remnants suggest that the settlers continued their craft, attempting to maintain their tools and weaponry while in this new environment. The co-location of English-style post holes, those unmistakably square and precise, in close proximity to traditional Native American round structures, paints a picture of two cultures living side by side, sharing space, and possibly blending communities. Adding to these material traces are fragments of European weaponry and pottery, including Surrey, Hampshire border ware shards, as well as decorative items like a floral clothing clasp, all hinting at a prolonged European domestic presence embedded within indigenous life. These finds move the assimilation hypothesis beyond mere speculation and into the realm of tangible proof of coexistence. Historical accounts lend narrative color to this archaeological fabric, notably from the English explorer John Lawson in 1701, over a century after Roanoke's disappearance. Lawson recorded that the Hatteras Indians, descendants of the Croatoan tribe, displayed distinct European features, including grey eyes, uncommon among indigenous peoples of the region. Even more telling was the assertion that some ancestors of the Hatteras could talk in a book, implying literacy and cultural assimilation. Lawson's descriptions suggested a blending not just of blood, but of customs, speech, and identity. According to him, the English settlers, compelled by dire circumstances, had not just cohabited with the Croatoans, but had gradually adopted their ways, effectively transforming into a hybrid community that valued and embraced its connections to English ancestry. This portrait aligns with the pressures the lost colony faced: extreme droughts, catastrophic shortages, and isolation from England, making integration a logical, even necessary choice. Unlike hostile tribes with whom relations had soured, the Croatoan were known allies and intermediaries. Manteo, a Croatoan himself, had been baptized and honored as Lord of Roanoke during the early years of settlement, indicating an existing friendly relationship that could have facilitated such blending. Yet, even as this theory appears the most plausible, it does not conclusively close the case. The fate of the colonists remains cloaked in mystery, an open-ended tale only partially illuminated by these clues. Questions persist about the extent of assimilation, the survival strategies of potential smaller groups, and what finally became of those who left Roanoke. Were they swallowed entirely into indigenous society, both culturally and genetically? Did they maintain aspects of their English identity? Did some continue to face new dangers or move further afield? These uncertainties underscore the complexity and enduring enigma of their story. Thus, the carved word croatoan is more than a mere inscription. It is a silent testament to human resilience, a deliberate message from a people forced to adapt in the face of overwhelming adversity. It beckons us to consider what survival means beyond mere existence, to transform, to blend, and to endure quietly in the shadows of history. While the mystery of Roanoke's fate remains unresolved, the archaeological evidence, historical accounts, and interpretive scholarship together illuminate a narrative of integration rather than annihilation, of a colony that vanished only to live on in a new form. As we reflect on these clues in the silence, we find ourselves poised at the crossroads of history and speculation. What began as a desperate act of survival carved into wood opens into a broader story about cultural collision, adaptation, and survival. This chapter in the saga of Roanoke closes not with a definitive end, but with a cautiously hopeful understanding of how lost colonists may have found a new beginning among the Croatoan, an enduring legacy that challenges us to listen closely and look deeper beneath the surface of silence. This examination sets the stage for exploring alternative fates and theories that seek to explain the many shadows still cast by the lost colony. But before we move forward, it is worth acknowledging sometimes the loudest stories come not from what is shouted, but from what is quietly carved into time itself. The mystery of Roanoke's lost colony has sparked countless theories over the centuries, each casting shadows of doubt and compelling us to reconsider what may have befallen those 115 men, women, and children who vanished without so much as a trace, except for that haunting word carved into wood, croatoan. Beyond the leading theory that these colonists sought refuge among the Croatoan tribe, alternative explanations have emerged, some dramatic in scope, others more subtle but no less provocative. Let us journey now into these divergent paths of speculation, weighing the evidence, the silences, and the tantalizing clues left frozen in time. One of the most harrowing proposals is that the colonists suffered a massacre at the hands of the Powhatan Confederacy. This narrative found its way into early English records, most notably through Captain John Smith, who, in 1607, was told by Chief Powhatan himself that he had destroyed the Roanoke settlers. Smith was even shown English utensils as claimed proof. Another early chronicler, William Strachey, relayed that a native informant named Machumps declared that the colonists were attacked, most slain, with a handful left alive. These stories were reinforced by instructions to Jamestown colonists to search for survivors at Oconomowoc and by markings on the 1608 Zuniga spy map, referencing Englishmen said to have journeyed to another settlement. Yet despite the dramatic flair and early acceptance by some, this massacre theory falters under the weight of physical evidence, or rather its conspicuous absence. The original colony site revealed no mass graves or bodies, no charred remains suggesting fiery destruction, no signs of a violent struggle or rapid abandonment. Instead, the settlement was dismantled, houses carefully taken apart, which intimates a deliberate, organized departure rather than a chaotic attack. Historians speculate that Powhatan may have embellished or fabricated the claim to bolster his political standing or to intimidate the newer English arrivals at Jamestown. The lack of corroborating forensic or archaeological proof makes the massacre theory a chilling but ultimately unsubstantiated possibility. Another grim hypothesis invokes the natural forces of famine and disease exacerbated by environmental catastrophe. Tree ring data from the region confirms that the colony's occupation coincided with the worst drought in 800 years, stretching from 1587 to 1589. This environmental disaster would have dramatically strained both English and indigenous food supplies. Already starved when emergency provisions failed to arrive, the colonists faced dwindling crops and hostile conditions that would have made survival untenable without outside assistance. Disease, too, likely played a role. Contact between indigenous populations and Europeans introduced new pathogens, and illnesses spread rapidly in cramped and unsanitary conditions. But even here, the narrative encounters difficulties. The quiet dismantling of homes argues against a colony wiped out silently by sickness, as one would expect to find graves or remains if they had succumbed en masse. Additionally, the Americas at that time harbored fewer deadly endemic germs compared to Europe, making a fatal epidemic wiping out all colonists less certain. Still, famine and disease may very well have contributed to the colonists' decline, pushing them toward desperate measures such as relocation or assimilation, which brings us to the intriguing inland relocation theory, a hypothesis that suggests the colonists didn't simply vanish, but moved away from the vulnerable coast, seeking refuge to the north or inland near the upper reaches of Albemarle Sound. This idea finds some support in the obscure cartographic markings on John White's 1585 map, notably a small fort symbol near the confluence of Salmon Creek and Albemarle Sound. White, before departing in 1587, allegedly left instructions for the settlers to move up to 50 miles inland if the coast became untenable. Archaeological excavations at what have been dubbed Site X and Site Y near these inland waterways have uncovered Elizabethan artifacts, pottery shards, weapons, and provisioning vessels, suggesting some English presence beyond the coastal islands. These are not mere trade goods, but items of domestic and military use, hinting at attempts by colonists or their descendants to establish a foothold in the interior. However, the archaeological consensus remains cautious. The artifacts may represent only a small group or family, perhaps a satellite settlement or a short-lived encampment, rather than the entire missing colony. And, crucially, no human remains or evidence of a large permanent settlement have been discovered, leaving this hypothesis intriguing but unverifiable. The Spanish attack theory also casts a long shadow. During this period, England and Spain were bitter rivals, locked in the Anglo-Spanish War. Spain's formidable presence in Florida made a covert strike against an English outpost plausible from a geopolitical standpoint. Yet, hauntingly, Spanish records contain no mention of such an attack, nor has archaeology uncovered battlefield debris, burned fortifications, or artifacts consistent with a violent conquest. The careful dismantling of the colony's buildings militates strongly against a sudden, hostile assault. The silence from historical documents and physical evidence alike consigns the Spanish attack idea to the realm of speculation, Beyond these historically grounded theories lies a sprawling landscape of fringe ideas and folklore, some whimsical, others tinged with the supernatural or driven by popular culture. These range from alien abductions and interdimensional disappearances to the enigmatic notion that croatoan was embraced as a mystical or cursed word. Tales suggest it was the last utterance of Edgar Allan Poe or appeared cryptically in Amelia Earhart's journal, though these claims lack foundation and lean more on myth-making than historical fact. Yet they reveal something important: the powerful hold this mystery has on our collective imagination, driving it far beyond dusty archives into literature, film, and the paranormal. This cultural fascination has grown into a commercial phenomenon, with numerous books, tours, and theatrical productions, most notably Paul Green's outdoor drama, The Lost Colony, captivating audiences for decades. The story's allure is undeniable, fed by uncertainty, tragedy, and the tantalizing possibility of secrets just out of reach. It is a reminder that mysteries live not only in facts, but also in the stories we tell ourselves about survival, identity, loss, and origin. Scholarly skepticism tempers enthusiasm for many proposed answers. Critiques point to issues with artifact stratigraphy, noting, for example, that some finds on Hatteras Island may date to the 17th century rather than the 16th. Some argue that European goods might have arrived through trade with later English explorers rather than directly from the lost colonists. Others underscore the absence of peer-reviewed validation for many archaeological claims. Such rigor is necessary lest storytelling override evidence and history slide into myth. The persistent absence of direct, unambiguous proof, no bodies, no mass graves, no unequivocal settlement remains, continues to frustrate definitive conclusions. Environmental changes, erosion, and shifts in geography over 4 centuries complicate the archaeological record. The possibility the colonists split, their members choosing divergent paths, some assimilating with the Croatoans, others venturing inland, adds layers of complexity to an already tangled puzzle. The lost colony of Roanoke stands not just as a historical enigma, but as a profound reflection on human determination amid hardship, the intersecting fates of indigenous and English peoples, and the limits of our knowledge. It challenges us to embrace uncertainty while pursuing truth with rigor and empathy. As we wrestle with shadows of doubt and delve into the fragments of evidence, the mystery invites each of us, as listeners, thinkers, and seekers, to dare to question, to speculate, and to share insights. The vanishing of Roanoke's colonists remains one of America's oldest, most absorbing unsolved enigmas, an enduring silhouette on the landscape of history that insists we look deeper and listen closely. What do you believe happened to the lost colony? Was it massacre, famine, relocation, assimilation, or something else entirely? The answers remain obscured, but the search continues, calling us ever onward into the silent shadows.